Several years ago, I faced the toughest battle of my life when I was diagnosed with advanced Hodgkin's lymphoma. This news was completely unexpected, as I had always lived a healthy lifestyle, complete with regular exercise, a balanced diet, and annual checkups. The oncologist explained that the causes of this type of cancer were not fully understood, and although the prognosis included a slim chance of survival, aggressive chemotherapy could potentially save my life. Determined to fight, I gathered my wife of 18 years, Megan, and our teenage daughter, Kelly, to share the daunting news. Their initial reaction was one of devastation, but I tried to instill hope, promising to do everything in my power to overcome the illness. Despite this, I was deeply concerned about the impact the diagnosis and subsequent treatment would have on our family dynamics. The doctor had cautioned that the side effects of chemotherapy could strain even the strongest relationships, and he noted that many marriages struggle under such stress. That evening, I shared these fears with Megan, who reassured me of her unwavering support through my illness. We were in a stable financial position thanks to my comprehensive insurance, significant savings, and a trust fund left by my late grandfather. Our home was fully paid off, and I had even secured funds for Kelly's college education, should anything happen to me. Chemotherapy began a week later and proved to be extremely grueling. Each session left me so exhausted and debilitated that it felt as though I had been struck by a freight train. I found myself unable to manage even the simplest tasks, such as feeding myself or taking a shower. Megan and Kelly became my pillars during this time, taking over household duties, driving me to medical appointments, and ensuring I had the necessary medications. They truly stepped up in a time of dire need. For 3 challenging months, I tried to keep my burdens to myself and help out around the house whenever I felt strong enough. However, I started noticing a change in my wife and daughter's behavior. Their willingness to assist me gradually diminished, and even simple requests like getting a glass of water or some fresh air seemed to irritate them. My daughter began to ignore my requests entirely. The tension peaked one morning when I was running late for an early chemotherapy session. My wife was still upstairs, and when I called to her, she suggested tiredly that I take an Uber because she needed a rest. Shocked by her response, I managed to arrange for both the ride and hospital support on my own. Thankfully, the Uber driver was exceptionally kind and even offered to bring me back home after the session. It was a relief, yet disheartening to depend so heavily on a stranger's kindness. Later that day, after some rest, I gathered the courage to address the growing distance between us. The air was chilly as I confronted my wife and daughter about their recent behavior. I asked them outright if they felt burdened by me. My wife sighed deeply and confessed that they were both feeling overwhelmed. My daughter timidly admitted that my needs during the illness were more than she had anticipated. Realizing we needed a solution, I proposed hiring a nurse for a few days each week to help with daily tasks and accompany me to my chemotherapy appointments. To prepare for days when I might be particularly weak, I'd also ordered a wheelchair. They both agreed to this plan. I contacted the hospital for recommendations, and they sent a nurse who was both kind and firm. She managed my appointments, ensured I took my medication, and even prepared healthy meals. With her help, my condition improved, which pleased my doctors. Despite these adjustments aimed at reducing their load, my wife and daughter still seemed unhappy. My wife felt increasingly sidelined by the nurse's presence. I suggested that if she felt ready to resume the responsibilities of caring for me, including taking me to my appointments, managing my medication, and ensuring I ate properly, we could consider letting the nurse go. This was the only reason I had suggested hiring help to ease the strain on us all. I brought in a nurse because my condition had become overwhelming for my wife to manage alone, and she reluctantly accepted this temporary solution. She suggested we look for a male nurse, but I explained that the hospital's list only included the nurse we had, who was specifically chosen for her expertise with cancer patients and her familiarity with my needs. This nurse was thorough, considerate, and showed great respect towards my family. I made it clear that the only condition under which we would consider replacing the nurse was if my wife and daughter were prepared to take over her duties. My wife was unhappy with this idea and suggested that I should be more self-reliant instead of letting my illness impact everyone else. I tried to explain that there were days when my condition left me too weak to even get out of bed, let alone handle daily tasks on my own. The chemotherapy had severely weakened me. In frustration, my wife stormed off and shoved herself upstairs, slamming doors in her wake. I decided to ignore her outburst, knowing that any negativity could only set back my recovery. My primary focus had to stay on regaining my health. Later that evening, my mother-in-law, who lived 3 states away, called to express her concern about having another woman in her daughter's house, despite the fact that the house was legally mine since I had purchased it before our marriage. I took a diplomatic approach in explaining the situation. I told her that the level of care I needed was more than my wife could handle on her own, and the nurse was here to lessen the strain on everyone. I reassured her that the nurse's stay was only meant to last through the remaining month of my chemotherapy, assuming no complications arose. While she seemed skeptical, she eventually ended the call, which was a relief to me. For about a week after that conversation, life went on fairly normally. My treatment proceeded without incident, and it seemed like we might be able to maintain a semblance of normality until one eventful day after I returned from a chemotherapy session. When I returned from my latest chemotherapy session, a moving truck parked in front of my house was the first thing I saw. My wife and daughter had packed all their belongings and were preparing to move to my mother-in-law's house. I was deeply hurt and upset, but the sheer exhaustion from the treatment kept me from fully expressing my emotions. The timing of their departure, right after a chemo session when I was most vulnerable, seemed particularly harsh. Seeking some understanding, I turned to my daughter. I asked her if she really wanted to leave, considering she was old enough to decide for herself. Her response was heartbreaking. She told me that she found it too difficult to be around me during my illness and preferred to live with her mother. Watching them drive away, I felt a profound sense of abandonment, which was one of my biggest fears when I started chemotherapy. In the midst of this emotional upheaval, my brother offered his support. He had noticed the nurse spending extra time with me that day and asked if I had any family nearby who could help. Although he lived 5 hours away and had his own family responsibilities, he didn't hesitate to take some time off work to stay with me. Upon his arrival, he was visibly upset about my wife's actions, calling her selfish and ungrateful. He reminded me that throughout our marriage, I had ensured she never had to work and always had everything she needed. His leave was only for a week, but he proposed another solution. His sister-in-law, Hannah, was in the middle of a difficult divorce and needed a safe place to stay. Hannah was studying radiology on a scholarship at a nearby university, and my house was conveniently closer to her campus than her current residence. We agreed that Hannah could stay with me. It would give her a place to escape the stress of her divorce, and I would have someone around in case of emergencies. I assured my brother that Hannah wouldn't have to worry about rent. Her company was more than enough compensation. She could pick any of the remaining rooms. I wasn't particular, as my wife and daughter had taken most of our belongings. Hannah moved in on the day my brother had to return home. He helped her settle in, and she was incredibly grateful for the opportunity to stay. She promised to be considerate, keep the place tidy, and help out wherever needed. Hannah was genuinely kind-hearted, and having her around brought a new sense of calm and companionship to the house during a challenging time in my life. I reassured Hannah that she wouldn't need to take on too much responsibility, since I had arranged for my nurse to come in every day of the week, an increase from the previous schedule of 4 days. After my brother left, I did my best to help Hannah settle into her new surroundings. Over the next few weeks, life found a sort of equilibrium. I missed my wife and daughter deeply, but it seemed I was alone in that sentiment, as they hadn't reached out to me at all. Hannah was incredibly helpful during this period. She took on the grocery shopping, handled most of the cleaning, and even helped prepare meals. She never complained, and her presence was both a comfort and a support. About a month and a half after my family left, I received incredible news. I was cancer-free. I celebrated by ringing the bell at the hospital, a significant milestone. My nurse, curious about my next steps, asked what I planned to do now that I was free from cancer. The answer was clear to me. I decided to file for divorce, seeking to free myself from a marriage that had lacked support during my most challenging times. With the divorce proceedings underway, my attention turned to recovery. It was a journey in itself. Gradually, I began to regain my strength, my hair grew back, scars began to heal, and I started gaining weight. I maintained a healthy diet, but allowed myself the occasional indulgence, enjoying the meals I had missed during my treatment. 8 months have passed since I was declared cancer-free, and I feel ready to move forward. I contacted my old job, and they offered to rehire me for remote work. I plan to accept, as I am also considering relocating. Despite my attachment to my current home, it holds too many painful memories. I'm looking for a fresh start in a smaller, quieter place. Unbeknownst to my wife, I intend to give the house to Hannah. She was there for me when I was at my lowest, showing immense kindness despite us being practically strangers. I want her to have the freedom to do with the house as she pleases, including selling it if she chooses. I no longer have any ties to it, especially if it might become a point of contention with my wife or daughter. I found a new place in a tranquil neighborhood in the countryside, and I am truly excited about this new chapter in my life. This is update number 1 on my journey towards a new beginning. Hello, wife and daughter. It's been more than a year since my initial diagnosis, and I've comfortably settled into my new neighborhood. This community is full of welcoming people, and I've become good friends with several neighbors, including Teresa, who lives across the street. Teresa is a widow whose children live far away, visiting only during holidays like Christmas and her birthday. One evening, Teresa invited me over for drinks on her porch. We shared stories, and she told me about her husband's battle with lung cancer and how life insurance had been a crucial support for her family. During our conversation, I opened up about my situation with you both. Surprisingly, I still haven't heard from either of you, but I've made peace with that. I've been filling my time with new hobbies, especially woodworking, and I'm gradually building up my collection of tools. Today, after coming back from the hardware store, Teresa mentioned that she had seen some people lingering around my house. They didn't do anything suspicious, but they knocked a few times, looked around, and waited in their car for a while. Teresa thought about calling the sheriff but held off, suspecting they might be family. When she described them, I realized she was talking about you too. I'm puzzled about how you found my new address, since only my brother and his wife know where I live. Teresa promised that if you returned, she would handle it and advised me not to confront you, given your abandonment during my toughest times. That night, I called my brother, who informed me that you had been causing trouble for Hannah and her roommate at my old house. Thankfully, Hannah had all the necessary documents to prove her ownership, which she had purchased from me. A wise decision on her part. Feeling sorry that Hannah had to endure this because of my family, I called her to apologize. If there's another visit, I hope to resolve the situation permanently. Regarding the divorce, my lawyer sent the documents to your mother's house, but they might have been dismissed as junk mail. At this point, I'm moving on, as our relationship is effectively over. Update number 2, you showed up again at my house, but earlier in the day while I was working remotely. When I heard the knock, I immediately turned to my security cameras to confirm my suspicion it was indeed them. My ex-wife appeared unchanged, but Kelly had matured into a young woman. Following the plan Teresa and I had discussed, I stayed indoors but moved closer to the door to better hear the exchange. Teresa, always the helpful neighbor, approached them to introduce herself. My wife inquired if she knew a man named James who used to live there. Teresa seemed as perplexed as I felt and questioned the phrasing used to. My wife then claimed that her husband, referring to me, not as her ex-husband, had lived here before his recent, untimely death after an extended hospital stay. I was astounded by this false narrative, as there was absolutely no record of my death, especially not at the hospital where I received my treatment. My wife further asserted that they were the rightful next of kin, implying ownership of the home. Teresa corrected her by stating that a James did indeed live there, but he was a divorcee. She also mentioned that during our time as neighbors, I had informed her of my wife leaving and my filing for a unilateral divorce. Teresa added that as far as she knew, I had planned to leave all my assets to charity since my only family was my brother. This revelation seemed to puzzle them, and the conversation momentarily lapsed into silence. Teresa then asked if they had a death certificate or a will, to which they admitted they did not. She explained that they would need those documents to claim ownership at the county's record office if they truly believed the property belonged to them. My wife reacted poorly to Teresa's suggestion. She questioned Teresa's authority, accusing her of being overly nosy and demanding she mind her own business. It was embarrassing to witness. The neighborhood had been incredibly welcoming to me, and here was my ex-wife causing a scene. Despite my urge to intervene and defend Teresa, I stuck to our plan. Teresa, ever gracious, apologized for any misunderstanding and explained she was only trying to help. She then returned to her house, and shortly after, my ex-wife and daughter left. I was relieved they were gone but felt a strong sense of gratitude towards Teresa for handling the situation with such dignity, protecting both my privacy and peace. I made my way over to Teresa's house to apologize for the disturbance. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand, commenting that while she found my wife's behavior distasteful, the outburst was somewhat amusing to her. I wished I could see the humor in it too, but knowing my wife's temper, I was concerned about what could happen if she returned. And indeed, she did come back the very next day. I was in my home office, deeply focused with my noise-canceling headphones on, when a loud crash jolted me out of my concentration. I hurried to the living room to discover my front window shattered. Outside, there was chaos, with neighbors trying to calm the situation. It turned out to be my ex-wife. She was the source of the commotion, having smashed the window herself. By the time I stepped outside, two of my elderly neighbors were trying their best to prevent her from doing further damage. Both she and Kelly were wielding bats and had already destroyed some of my potted plants. I caught hold of her arm and bluntly asked if she had lost her mind. Clearly taken aback by my presence, likely shocked to see me alive, I firmly told them to leave my property immediately or I would call the police. Unknown to me, my neighbors had already made the call. In a hurt tone, she questioned why I hadn't reached out after recovering. She claimed that she and Kelly would have returned if they knew. I countered that when we married, we had vowed to support each other through sickness and health, a vow she had broken. I had no intention of rekindling our relationship. She was no longer my wife, as I had sent the divorce papers months ago. I reiterated my demand for them to leave. Then, she brought up our daughter, mentioning her upcoming college expenses and her inability to afford the tuition on her own. My response was cold but honest. I reminded her that Kelly had chosen to leave me too. I was prepared to relinquish all my parental rights. They should have considered the consequences of their actions before abandoning me. I wanted nothing to do with either of them. Her sadness quickly turned to anger as she called me selfish and heartless. This confrontation, though harsh, reaffirmed my decision to disconnect from a relationship that had left me isolated when I needed support the most. I couldn't help but find the irony in the situation slightly amusing. My ex-wife, of all people, was calling me selfish. In a moment of anger, I retorted, calling her an entitled jerk and firmly stating that she would not receive another dime from me. Just as I said this, she swung a bat at me, but the timing couldn't have been worse for her, as the police arrived just in that moment. The officers immediately intervened, arresting both her and my daughter. They inquired if I wanted to press charges, and without hesitation I agreed. As my ex and daughter were being led to the police car, they began crying loudly, but their tears did not move me. I had recorded the entire incident, including my wife smashing the window, and had already handed the footage over to the police. After finishing up my work for the day, I ordered a replacement for the broken window and started cleaning up the shattered glass. For the time being, I secured the window with a tarp to keep the elements out. Teresa kindly lent me some buckets to house my plants until I could get into pots. Curious about what drove my ex-wife to such extremes, I did some investigating. It turned out that her mother had passed away 4 months earlier, and they discovered that the house they were staying in belonged to her husband's cousin, not to them. The cousin had decided to evict them because he planned to sell the property. With nowhere to go following the sale of most of their belongings, my ex-wife and daughter had been living in a motel. Their desperation led them back to our old house, where seeing Hannah led them to wrongly assume I had died. They began snooping around for any possible records of my assets or purchases, which eventually led them to me. Now they faced charges for vandalism, attempted break-in, and attempted assault. Since Kelly is a minor, she is sentenced to community service, but my ex-wife faces jail time for her premeditated actions. I am also considering obtaining a restraining order to ensure my safety and peace of mind. At least for now, I can rest easy knowing I won't have to deal with any further disruptions from her for quite some time.